Hello and welcome. This is the Studio Stack podcast. Each week we go behind the scenes and talk to industry leaders about what it takes to build, join, and invest in startup studios. I am your host, Deanna Lesage, and this podcast is your Startup Studio Masterclass. Today on the show, we have Giuseppe Lacerenza. In addition to founding two of his own companies, Giuseppe spent 5 years in management at McKinsey and has been both an angel and a professional investor. He now leads the venture building arm of Slimmer AI, scouting and prototyping AI applied solutions. As a tech enthusiast, Giuseppe has a very diverse background, and it was such a pleasure chatting with him. In today's episode, you'll learn about the process Slimmer AI goes through in building companies and how they took an idea to exit in just 8 months. We talk about how AI can be a competitive long-term moat for venture scale companies, why specializing as a studio is a successful strategy, and so much more. Giuseppe has a wealth of knowledge on both the AI and venture studio fronts. I know you're going to love this one, so I will get out of the way. Enjoy the episode. Hello. Hi, Giuseppe. Thank you for coming on the Studio Stack podcast. How are you today?
I'm really good. Thanks for having me today.
Absolutely. I'm so excited to talk about Slimmer AI. I think you guys have really cool models, and the unique way that you're operating is very interesting to me. So let's get started. Let's just dive in. Question number one, what is your definition of a startup studio?
I've been thinking about this for a while now, and I think a startup studio is a factory of startup. I like to think like through the lenses of two main ingredients, a disciplined process, but also an expertise, with one goal to mitigate the risk of failure and accelerate the growth. So I think that's how I see it as a startup studio.
Yeah, definitely. I think the piece around eliminate failure and accelerate growth is really interesting to have in the definition, because in my definition of venture studios and startup studios, really it's about reducing the startup failure rate. Like, I think that's the point of the repeatable processes and kind of everything that studios do is to really make building a startup, a very de-risked as possible
Yeah.
process.
I do see a lot of value in basically a compounding effect on the learning. So making the best of being a serial entrepreneur. I always say that a startup studio is able to make a first-time founder serial entrepreneur just by leveraging all the learnings that come through the ventures. And I think this is a quite unique synergies for the studio. So that's where I think part of the de-risking comes in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think capturing those learnings and making sure that you are building off of them and not repeating the same mistakes with the next one is a really, like you said, compounding learning is a really important concept with studios. And so tell me a little bit about Slimmer AI and the evolution of the studio from when you started to where it's at today.
Yeah. So Slimmer AI is built on 10 years plus of experience in building applied AI solution. Usually born as a consulting company in the applied AI space out of the University of Groningen, and then pivoted 2 years ago under the belief that tech talent is a scarce resource, and then AI is going to change the way people work today. So that's where we ended up building a venture studio that focused on B2B SaaS solution, where artificial intelligence is at the core of the competitive moat of the company. And we do it because we can leverage all the experience built in building applied AI solution beyond the hype of artificial intelligence.
Yeah. And so your thesis is artificial intelligence as the technology that goes into kind of all of your ventures. And how do you leverage AI in the sense of your building the startups? Like, if you build, for example, I talked to an agency startup that said, when we build the UX, like when we build a home screen, when we build a login, we use that same login for every application that we build on top of that. And I feel like the same could apply to AI. Is that, part of the thesis around like why Venture Studio makes sense?
I don't think there is one solution that fits all, but definitely there are synergies and way of thinking. So the AI component is core since the assessment of the ideas through all the journey. Sometimes AI is not present in the early days of a company because it's need like a significant amount of data to really apply artificial intelligence on the concept that we build. But we keep it in mind with the line of sight through all the strategy of the product, as well as the way we collect data to make sure that while the company is scaling is already set up for success, where we see the artificial intelligence playing a differentiator role into it.
Yeah. And do you build your own ventures from inside the studio, or do you typically work with entrepreneurs who bring ideas to the studio, or some kind of a
We
hybrid?
do three different archetype. So I think the first one is where we generate idea internally under like some investment thesis. So we look at the space and we define where we want to play, and based on where we believe AI is going to make a difference. And then the second archetype is we call it co-build, where we build with the entrepreneur, deep domain expert entrepreneur, and then we are able to deploy both human capital and financial capital, especially because we are able to deploy a dedicated tech squad on the ground since day one to build the MVP. And then the third archetype is where we invest, where we are closer to an hands-on investor, where we are able to support companies that already exist in their early days, so pre-seed and seed, only where we believe that there is unlocked potential on the artificial intelligence part, and we can help the company to capture it. We like to say that we are a tech company and we are proud of it. And we like to believe that we are focused on building businesses and product more than investing into them.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you're working with founders, and so you have the two previous parts, right? There's this kind of internal company generation, and then there's this kind of work co-building with founders. For the internal company generation, what kind of founder? When do you bring in the entrepreneur to lead, an internally generated venture, and what's the profile of that founder? Versus when you're looking at a founder who's kind of bringing you an idea, is that the same profile? Or kind of just talk a little bit about the
Now,
characteristics?
it's a really interesting question. Thanks for asking, because I do think that this is, let's say, a core challenge of every venture studio, because ultimately it goes down to the people that will run the business. When it comes to the internal idea generation, we try to validate internally our hypothesis and then finding a launching customer. And at that point, we bring on board the CO to be of the company early enough to shape the business, not, let's say, not too late to basically not feeling the ownership of it.
Mm.
While I think when it comes to the co-build, we look for entrepreneurs that have deep domain knowledge, as we are kind of focusing on the full spectrum of B2B SaaS. We are keen to leverage the domain expertise of the entrepreneur, as well as the grit of solving a problem that most likely they have faced. For
Yeah.
us, it's really important to see in the entrepreneur the granular understanding of the problem that they are trying to solve. And if they have been part of the pain, I think that's a plus one in the assessment.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's the deep domain expertise is something that when you're finding that in a founder, that's a high value add, especially because it just takes so long to get that and build up that domain knowledge. So I totally agree with that. And so we had first connected after I read an article on Biller, the company that you kind of took from idea to a successful exit in, what was it? Was it 8 months?
Yeah, indeed. Quite short journey, but an exciting one.
Exactly. And so like I think that was so impressive. I had to reach out to you, and I would love for you to kind of walk through that project and the journey, focusing kind of on the model of your studio and how you were able to produce that in such a short period of time. And I mean, that is just the ultimate success. Every venture studio is looking for that level of execution and speed. So would love for you to talk a little bit about how you did it. And I think that will give the audience a great insight into how you work as a studio as well.
Yeah, indeed. Let me build on the sequel of your question that you had before. So when we look at the entrepreneur, we want to make sure that they are able to cover three key things. One is understanding the problem and solving through the product building. Then is being able to sell it, so is the commercial element into it. And the third part is also the team, so being able to attract talent, and is the leadership part. So when we met Derek Uwe and Mick in I think it was exactly a year ago, so it was around February a year ago. We were actually quite impressed by their deep understanding of the market. They came from player in the payment industry like Molly and Klarna, so they've been facing what was the problem in the B2B space, as well as the commercial attitude to rally the market behind it and attract talent. So we decided to onboard on the journey on April last year, so exactly 1 year ago. And I think the beauty of our model was that we were able to deploy a dedicated tech squad of 6 engineers since 1st of April to basically build an MVP. They were live with the first customer in 4 months. And I find it quite impressive compared to the typical journey that as a founder you need to go through if you don't have a dedicated CTO or if you need to hire your own technical people.
Yeah, and you have quite a big technical team, and I think that is one of the advantages of Slimmer AI as a studio specifically. And different studios have different resources. Some have tech talent on staff, some don't. But what's the resource value add that you point to as a studio? I mean, the tech talent being one, but what else do you provide? Founders and startups with as part of your model?
Yeah. We like to say that we are co-founder all in all. I think while we believe that the differentiator stands in the ability to deploy the tech talent, we do have 30 engineers, software and machine learning engineers, that are always working on cutting edge problem in the AI space. But we also provide all the support to, first of all, minimize distraction. So anything that needs to be done but is a distraction from product and sales in the early days. And you can think about admin, HR, anything that is really needed, but not on the critical path. But also like being able to support them on other topics like marketing, branding, commercial, that ultimately are core to set up the foundation of the companies and get the early traction that is needed for the fundraising. So I think we are an all-in-all solution that I think is differentiated by the ability to deploy also a tech squad on the ground day one, but as all the hygiene factor in the venture studio and the venture capital space to be able to support entrepreneur across all the topics that are needed in the early days.
Yeah. And when you're thinking about the early days of working with a company, one of the questions I had when I was kind of looking at your site and the things that you guys kind of work on, how you deploy your tech talent, is this AI component. And so like I built a venture last year, right, that I thought needed AI involved in it, and it very likely didn't. And so I think working with a studio to have helped me understand that faster would have saved me a ton of time, effort, money, etc. So one of the questions I had was, how do you determine which startups to work with, and like how do you apply the kind of knowledge of what you have as what needs to be used with artificial intelligence and what doesn't necessarily? And do you work with companies that only need to apply that artificial intelligence layer because that's where your superpowers lie?
Yeah, indeed. So it's a really good question, and we developed a proprietary framework to do so. So we assess the company first as an independent opportunities. That's I think a classic VC approach where we look at the market, the team, whether this can be an opportunity that can scale across a significant market. But on top of this, we do have a proprietary framework where we look at the superpower of the AI. And the framework is split across two main dimensions. One is the data dimension, so understanding the data that are needed, as well as the potential to collect a proprietary set of data that is going to be a competitive moat in the journey. And I think the other dimension is the machine learning part. So understanding how the machine learning can be better than the human at doing this job, and what is the feedback loop that is going to strengthen such a positioning with the scalability of the company. So you need to picture like a matrix of 2 by 2, where we look at the status quo of the data and the machine learning today, as well as the long-term view of the data and the machine learning impact. And we can understand what is the potential of the AI into it. We will not build a company where we are not convinced that AI is going to be the core competitive moat in the long run, just because it's not part of our superpower.
Yeah. And when you're thinking about working with a company, what if they don't have AI built in or machine learning in the moment and they are kind of looking at that on the roadmap and wanting to work with you? Do you help them build out that competitive advantage, or is that something that you're expecting they would have, kind of already started on that path?
Absolutely. I think that's where we are able to create the value. Like, we don't expect a company to have AI in day one. And we
Mhm.
also see sometimes companies that, even at later stage, and we look at company at seed, where the full potential is still not captured. And I think it's fair, it's fine. I think that the critical part of every new venture is on building something that someone is willing to pay and gain traction on it. What we see is also that AI can contribute to solve the problem, but also like consolidate the competitive moat in the long run. So there are companies that have a fantastic traction in the early days where AI is still not, let's say, at the full potential, but where we see we can bring a lot of value in capturing that while going through, the next phases of the company and make sure that they can have a competitive moat that is a differentiator versus the other competitor.
Yeah. And I think that's super critical as far as the competitive moat and having studios be the driving force for that, because it does take entrepreneurs an incredibly long time to develop what that is on their own, because there's 50 things that could be. So I think working with a studio that specializes in a certain technology or a certain business model helps to get that really quickly. And in my opinion, that's one of the kind of three value adds of studios are speed. That's number one, and then support and I think networks as well.
Uh,
And so speaking on networks, how do you help your startup companies start to scale, like kind of go to market and scale? And do you work globally? Do you work with entrepreneurs and startups all over the world, or is it kind of located specifically?
Yeah, so we are based out of Amsterdam. We are a pan-European studio, so we actually focus on the full European scope. We don't work globally because being hands-on and being like really ride or die in the mindset that we have, the time zone can be actually, let's say, a bottleneck in the way we operate in the day-to-day. Uh,
Mhm.
but we have a quite hybrid setup. We're not forced to be in person, and we try to also build a community around all the company. We see a lot of value is in connecting all the company of the Slimmer AI family. So also being a bit the catalyzer of connection between the management teams of all the companies that we invested or built. I do think that that's a key contribution to the network effect. And on top of it, we also have an established network of investors and operator that, as advisor, help our companies in the early days to take the right choice, and also a network of potential customer, launching customer. So we try to develop a suite that simplify the journey of an entrepreneur in the early days, so they can really focus on building the product and sell it to the right customer. That I think should be the job of an entrepreneur in the first 6 months.
That could not be more true. The studio model works really, really well when you allow the entrepreneur or the entrepreneurs, the team, to focus on building product and getting customers. And then the studio handles kind of everything else, which you alluded to, HR, back office, formation of the company, setting up a bank account, like all of those things. And then just in your case, also the technical side. So helping them with the engineering and so that they can really build the product and start selling. And then the network, I think, is a really interesting piece because you brought up that there's essentially two pieces of the network. There's the customer potential, like the list of the customers, that network, and then there's the investors that might work with the studio in kind of a follow-on way when the startup is ready to spin out of the studio. And I think both of those are very critical. And when you specialize as a studio, like you do, and not all studios do. Some are industry agnostic and technology agnostic and business model agnostic. Like they kind of build a random assortment of everything. I think that's really tough because you don't have these reusable customer lists. And so that's a great strategy. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about, thinking about like the spin out and then investors kind of investing in the companies. Like what does that journey look like from starting a company with Slimmer AI to basically spinning it out? What pieces are there? What considerations do you guys evaluate as far as like stage gates and
Now,
different, yeah.
now, so I think first and foremost, our incentives is in building internal capabilities. So because we basically can invest also the tech resources, what we make sure is that there is a smooth transition while we support the hiring of dedicated tech team in the company. And I think that's our key priority. When we start building a company, our priority is to make sure that the company is independent and standalone, and is at certain point being able to run on his own. So I think that's the intermediate step before getting to the point of the spin out. Now, I think after having a product in production with the first launching customer, an early proof point of traction. And when we say traction, we don't necessarily mean a revenue booked, but we want to make sure that there is a customer that is using the product on the day to day and is basically solving a problem. When we have such a proof point, then we start thinking about the spin out. That is not necessarily a spin out per se, but most of the company, when we co-build, are born to be independent company. But we start thinking about bringing on board the next investor and then prepare it for the next phase. And that's what we call the fundraising phase, where we want to make sure that there is a full team. So we have filled all the skilled in the founding team, if there are any. We have a dedicated internal team with a CTO and a team of developers that now is part of the company. And there is a clear strategy now to bring what we have done together from the first customer to the next 100. So that's a bit how we see it happening. When it comes down to building internal ideas, I think it's a bit it's slightly different because these are companies that are really born out of the Slimmer AI, but we try to make them independent as early as possible to avoid any challenging in the spin out.
Yeah. And I think the point about traction, I love that you kind of detailed what you meant by traction, because it definitely, in a venture studio context, traction is different. And first of all, traction is different with different business models. So B2C
Yeah.
versus B2B. And I think it's really important for each venture studio to define their own metric of traction. Like what does a successful company, super early stage company look like for us? Because it's not the industry norms and standards. You are doing things differently, bringing in, you don't have full-time people. You have, experts coming in and helping out with the product build versus sitting on as kind of part of the core team. So it's different. And I love that you kind of highlighted that. And so when you look for traction, just what are some of the indicators that a company is going to be successful? You said first, kind of paying customer, and then secondly you said also the customer using the product daily. That's
Yeah.
like daily active users. Is there anything else?
Yeah, so we'll really look at the engagement of the customer in the early days. So when I say the customer using the product daily, is about being able to collect their input. That at that moment is more valuable than anything else. So the feedback that we get from the customer, their engagement with the product that we have built, are actually our biggest proof point that we are on the right track to build something meaningful in the next phases. While I think sometimes having early, revenue that are not necessarily connected to a usage and engagement of the customer can be misleading in terms of traction. So that's what we we care the most in those days is basically have all the inputs and also like the product that is used. In the end, we are product builder, and
Yeah.
we are happy if people use our product to solve their problem.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think the qualitative nature of a lot of the studio activities is something that would probably surprise the rest of the ecosystem, especially because studios are this kind of innovation vehicle that is really built on repeatable processes and data driven success. So there's a lot of data that goes into it. And the more you build ventures, the more data you'll have on the success of them. But it's still, even the biggest studios that are operating and have the biggest unicorns and successes, a lot of their early stuff is qualitative validation. So I think that's great.
Uh,
And so, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, sorry, and I was saying like it's a B2B software, so sales cycle are different. Engagement of customer are different from B2C dynamics. So it's also important to put through the lenses of the industry and the dynamics of it, what we call traction. I mean, selling to an enterprise software can take up to 6 months.
Yep.
So it's really important to give value. So for us, having 2, 3 early customers that are engaged are actually a really good proof point of foundational of a good ramping up of the next phase.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And so, speaking of next phase, what do you have going on at the studio these days? Are you working on a couple of new ventures? And where, how can our entrepreneurs in the audience get involved?
Yeah, we do have an upcoming ventures that is really exciting. We're working with two founders on solving the journey of lawyers in managing complex cases uh, through tons of documents. And we strongly believe that such a process is repetitive, is tedious, prone to error, and to a certain extent is not sustainable because people keep printing tons of paper instead of doing this through digital tools. So that's what we are working on. So stay tuned for it.
Sounds
And
like
of course,
I was going to say, sounds like a good use case for AI. Tedious, repetitive.
exactly. And that's why we're really excited. I think we really believe that AI can make a difference in this industry. And the industry is going through a shift now, while still being a bit conservative, is adopting more and more digital solution to rethink the way they work. So we're really excited about it. And of
Yeah.
course, we are always open to new ideas. So if there are entrepreneurs out there that are keen to change the way people work in the B2B space through AI, feel free to reach out.
Yeah, absolutely. And so is that a little bit of a focus? I always think it's helpful when studios have this kind of like, you obviously have a technology thesis, but is there types of businesses that you like to build as well? So it sounds like B2B and changing maybe the future of work and then deep domain expertise. So if there's this kind of like niche or space like law, and to your point, I mean, my first job ever was an internship at a law firm, and I was absolutely blown away by the amount of paper. It was like there's rows and rows. They had to like open a warehouse, get a facility for all of their files, like paper files. And I was like, you guys know we have computers, right? Like there's hard
It's
drives for stuff. Like
it's
what?
insane.
It's
We're
crazy.
we're still shocked by the amount of paper that gets printed and the amount of hours spent on reading it. So I think
Mm,
that's what we are going after. But yes, I think a good summary is we are tech focused, but we look at the B2B SaaS space, most likely vertical. So applied AI in a specific industry. We also look at the opportunities in the horizontal space like ML ops, but that's not necessarily our focus. We want to build products that are solving a real problem in a vertical space. So either is the lawyers, or we built an anti-money laundering solution for bank and payment provider, or a commodities intelligence solution for agricultural commodities player where we invested. So that's a bit our thesis, and we clearly keep always a line of sight on where AI can be also as a force for good, So clearly super interested in the sustainability and how we can make this a better world and topic around this.
Yeah, I love that. I think AI has so much potential, machine learning, but it's also buzzwordy. Like everybody claims to know what they're doing and apply it to every project. And I love that you guys are specializing in it and are really saying, we have a deep understanding of when and where this should be applied. And you and I have talked offline about that. And I think you guys do really actually get it. And you have engineers on staff. And so entrepreneurs in the audience, I would encourage you to reach out, especially if you think there's a potential for your project to apply AI. Giuseppe is a wealth of knowledge, would be a fantastic person for you to connect with and learn from and kind of run questions by. And so Giuseppe, where can they find you and Slimmer AI? Like if anyone wants it, there's kind of investors interested, corporates, entrepreneurs interested in getting involved and connecting with you, where should they go?
I think the easiest part is to connect through LinkedIn. They can look at our website, slimmer.ai, where they can get a bit of a sneaky view on what we do and how we do it. But always happy to connect through LinkedIn with fellow entrepreneur and help in any way possible.
Oh, that's so great. I love that. And perfect. I'll throw those in the show notes. Thank you so much for coming on. It was always a pleasure to speak with you and learn so much.
Thanks for having me.
Of
Really
course.
appreciate it.